I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Kara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. We've had a lot of people asking for this, and the time has finally arrived. Today we're going to begin a series on psychedelics in early Mormonism. A little background if you're new to the show or you haven't heard episodes on this subject in the past. Back in June of 2016, we discussed the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and I spoke a bit about the possibility that something was in the anointing oil which caused the mass visions and the ecstatic experiences that were recounted by contemporary attendees. That's back on episode titled Kirtland Temple Hallucination. As soon as the episode aired, I received an email from a guy named Cody Noconi, which says, "Hello, I'm a permaculture designer specializing in micro-remediation and plant medicines. I believe I can help you hone your argument that Joseph Smith was using psychotropic plant medicines and potentially drugging his parishioners with them. I can provide new evidence for several entheogenic candidates, as well as confirmation that the Smith family had the ability and know-how to do this. It is shockingly easy and efficient to extract medicinal compounds using wine or spirits. I can't imagine how busy you are with everything, so for the sake of keeping this brief, I won't go into more detail. This is a huge topic that I think deserves a lot more attention. If you're interested in discussing this further, I left my contact information below." End quote. We got together. Luckily, Cody doesn't live far from me, and that began our collaborative efforts of studying psychedelics in early Mormonism. From that time forward, we began writing a paper which we self-published and presented the following year at Sunstone in Salt Lake City, titled Revelation Through Hallucination, a treatise on the Smith entheogen theory. The reception from the presentation and from the paper was fantastic. Helping us put together the pamphlet was a previous Sunstone presentation, which was titled Restoration in the Sacred Mushroom, which was written and published in Sunstone magazine by Dr. Robert Beckstead back in 2007, 10 years prior. Fast forward another year after the paper was published, and Robert Beckstead contacted Cody and I to collaborate with him on an updated version of our Sunstone paper to be published in an actual peer-reviewed psychedelics journal. We gladly agreed, and now, over a year and a half since that writing process began, the paper was published in a special edition of the Journal of Psychedelics Studies. The reception, again, has been fantastic so far. Here's the thing. It's a long article. Most Journal of Psychedelics Studies articles max out at about 15 pages, but because ours was a special edition, it's just a shade under 50 pages. We had the good fortune of one of the journal's editors, Michael Winkelman, collaborating on the paper as well as the process, and let's just say it was wonderfully expedited and lenient with respect to the standard page limitation. Because the paper is relatively long, we're going to spend the next few episodes going through it, and I'll add a small bit of commentary or clarification or further information where necessary. Why are we doing this? Well, reading Mormon history can be dry sometimes, okay? There's a barrier of entry to understanding Mormon history academic papers and books because the field builds upon itself. Not many people are going to take the time to sit and read an article, especially if it requires them to have, a bunch of other articles and books and 15 other browsers open to research the information deeper. It also helps that, hey, I'm going to be traveling for this upcoming holiday season, like I assume many of you will be as well, and reading through this paper allows me to still get you content even while I'm out of the studio. But the most important reason that I'm reading this paper to all of you fantastic listeners is because I need you. Look, I know that y'all are smart and skeptical and you know your way around Mormon history because you're listening to this podcast and maybe you've read a couple of the big main history books or you know a bit about more Mormon history than I do. And we need feedback on this paper. Now, y'all are far from objective evaluators of this information because, let's face it, I've been priming you for a peer-reviewed article like this or psychedelics in early Mormonism for years by this point. but the more feedback that we get on the subject, the better. What's more, this paper takes a bit of a shotgun approach to the evidence and to the candidate entheogens. We've included a lot of information that may extend this Smith entheogen theory beyond the weight that the evidence can hold. So we want to scrub any untenable points from the theory and bolster what is strongest in the theory. There's that old canard of it's better to put forward your 3 best arguments instead of your 10 good arguments. This paper is the 10 good arguments version of the Smith entheogen theory, and we want it to start a discussion about psychedelics in the field of Mormon history and a discussion about Mormon history in the field of psychedelics. Thus, the subtitle of A Working Hypothesis is best fitting for the purpose this paper seeks to fill. 2 more points to make, and then we'll get started. When I presented on this at the John Whitmer Historical Conference in September of 2019, the primary feedback from the historians in attendance was, show us your work. Look, presenting on psychedelics in early Mormonism is really cool. Talking about it on the podcast is helpful to reach, kind of a broad audience, but until a peer-reviewed paper is published, everything else amounts to just talking, right? Well, now we can show our work in a peer-reviewed journal. For images, for tables, for footnotes, audio is admittedly kind of a tough medium. So, of course, you're going to find a link to the full article in the show notes, and I am reading this onto the podcast with express permission from the Journal of Psychedelics Studies and from the other authors of the paper. Final point to make, and I promise we'll get started. Years ago, I promised the listeners of this show I'd get you a book on early Mormonism if you hired me full-time. When I made that promise, I had no idea what writing a history book required or the process behind it. And I feel bad for not keeping to the agreed-upon timeline, even though y'all did decide to hire me. Well, here's the skeleton of that book. The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, A Working Hypothesis. Written by Robert Beckstead, Bryce Blankenagel, Cody Noconi, and Michael Winkelman. Historical documents relating to early Mormonism suggest that Joseph Smith, 1805 to 1844, employed entheogen-infused sacraments to fulfill his promise that every Mormon convert would experience visions of God and spiritual ecstasies. Early Mormon scriptures and Smith's teachings contain descriptions consistent with using entheogenic material. Compiled descriptions of Joseph Smith's earliest visions and early Mormon convert visions reveal the internal symptomology and outward bodily manifestations consistent with using an anticholinergic entheogen. Due to embarrassing symptomology associated with these manifestations, Smith sought for psychoactives with fewer associated outward manifestations. The visionary period of early Mormonism, fueled by entheogens, played a significant role in the spectacular rise of this American-born religion. The death of Joseph Smith marked the end of visionary Mormonism and the failure or refusal of his successor to utilize entheogens as part of religious worship. The implications of an entheogenic origin of Mormonism may contribute to the broader discussion of the major world religions with evidence of entheogen use at their foundation and illustrate the value of entheogens in religious experience. Introduction. The number and quality of spiritual experiences reported by participants in early Mormonism far exceed the daily background frequency reported in today's general population. Multiple supernatural and naturalistic explanations have been suggested to account for the sheer number of early Mormon visions and ecstasies, including rational supernaturalism, out-of-body experiences, animal magnetism or mesmerism, prophetic charisma, dissociation secondary to childhood trauma, enthusiasm associated with the Second Great Awakening, apparent materialization of the sacred during trance, pious fraud, and automatic writing. However, no single explanation has, to date, successfully accounted for the number and quality of visions in early Mormonism, nor can these modalities explain the on-demand visions that were neither spontaneous nor the result of prolonged austerities. To date, Joseph Smith's and early Mormon converts' visionary experience are neither easily defined nor understood. Against this background, we present compelling evidence suggesting that many early Mormon visionary experiences were facilitated by entheogenic substances that resulted in mood elevation and heightened spiritual awareness among early Mormon converts. All right, let's take a minute to work with these terms briefly, because all of these terms discussed in the introduction are going to play heavily into the rest of the paper. Entheogen is a relatively fluid definition. It was originally coined by psychedelics researchers in the 1970s to describe any plant which facilitates a specific type of altered states of consciousness. Peyote, mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, salvia, ayahuasca, and many other plant medicines fall into this category. The 70s experienced a moratorium on researching these psychoactive plants, and the term psychedelic in popular culture had kind of departed from its previous clinical definition. Thus, entheogen was coined. More modern psychedelic research has reclaimed the term of psychedelic, and entheogen itself has taken on a much broader definition. Entheogen now refers largely to the practice in which psychedelics are utilized in order to facilitate specific altered states of consciousness. So, psychedelics can be used in non-entheogenic contexts, during which they're often referred to as something like, party drugs or rave drugs or whatever. An entheogenic session more often includes meditation, sensory deprivation, administration of the psychedelic plant medicine, and then programming of the trip both before and after the experience. So, to put that into context or kind of lay terms, doing mushrooms with friends and watching a funny movie, that's taking psychedelics, right? Doing mushrooms after a period of fasting and meditation with somebody who can be a babysitter, a shaman, with a face mask to block the light and relaxing music playing, and then a debrief session after the trip, that is an entheogenic session in the modern definition of entheogen. However, things like prayer circles, meditation rings, drum circles, sweat lodges, mystical dancing, specific types of breath work, tantric sex, and many other ritualistic practices can be used entheogenically, often utilizing psychoactive plant medicine, psychedelics, as a catalyst or a facilitator of the session, but those sessions can also be done without the psychedelic to achieve similar altered states of consciousness. Put simply, this is the dose, set, and setting equation. Setting is the time and place. Set is the mindset with which you enter the entheogenic setting, and dosage refers to the psychoactive plant medicine and the amount ingested. Altered states of consciousness can be achieved through set and setting alone, but dosage increases the likelihood of success, especially in large groups, and also having the dosage requires less precision with the set and setting variables of the entheogenic equation. So let's get into that term a little bit as well. Altered states of consciousness. What does that mean? This can mean many, many things, but it has a very strict definition within psychedelic and entheogen research. In broader psychology, altered states of consciousness refers to any state of mind that's not within what we call the default mode network or the default state network. So the default mode network is basically where your brain is when you're thinking about what's going on around you, or when you daydream, when you recall a memory, when you feel an emotion, when you talk about yourself, or you're just thinking, as we call it, when our mind is actively processing something that's often based on external stimuli. Default mode network is what we call feeling quote-unquote normal, even though that term is pretty loaded in and of itself. Altered states of consciousness disrupt the default mode network. And the analogy that I use to kind of understand this, and this is informed by the book How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, it goes kind of like this. When you're just doing your thing, just being who you are, your brain is transmitting information on like well-traveled highways of neural pathways. You know, our brains are wired for efficiency, and these pathways are kind of like a canal system or a highway system of neuronal activity. Well, psychedelics flood the canals, and they completely alter the default mode network such that those commonly used pathways are no longer how the brain is interacting with itself. This is the altered state of consciousness within the psychedelic field. These altered states of consciousness, facilitated by entheogenic practices utilizing psychedelics, facilitate what we call spiritual or mystical experiences with a high degree of success and reliability. Right? See how this whole field is kind of building on itself. All of these terms are working with each other in order to create a system of terminology that I'm trying to introduce you, the listener, to, that we can agree upon and work with in order to understand this paper within its much broader context. Now, I said the term spiritual or mystical experiences. Obviously, that's an extremely loaded term as well, but it basically refers to the internally perceived experience of the participant. And that experience can manifest in all sorts of incredible ways, from the lowest degree of like seeing meaning and connections and, what's like what you might call supernatural phenomena when none of those things exist, all the way to the highest degree of transcendent spiritual mystical experiences of hallucinations and ego dissolution, loss of identity, and what many people call profound oneness with everything around the user. And what's notable about this, an atheist, a faithful Christian, and a faithful Muslim will experience similar spiritual or mystical phenomena when using similar substances in similar entheogenic contexts, although their respective experiences, especially when reflected upon, and their takeaways will largely be informed by their culture and their faith tradition or lack thereof. And of course, everybody's threshold for achieving that altered state of consciousness varies on an individual basis. These spiritual or mystical experiences can be used therapeutically, and some very early research into treating depression and PTSD and many other mental wellness issues is very promising and is indeed where these plant medicines got their start in the mid-1940s through the early 1960s before psychedelics association with anti-government counterculture and the so-called hippie movement in general. So, those are some definitions which will become very important to contextualizing the rest of this paper. Let's continue. In this entheogenic working hypothesis of early Mormonism, we consider the supernatural as natural and entheogens as medical therapy. Because the two largest factions of Mormonism have opened their libraries to everyone and primary source materials are so abundant and available, far more so than for more ancient religions, Mormonism may provide insight into the role entheogens played in the early success of traditional religions. Visionary experience as veridical. Converts who reported angelic visitations, ecstasies, and visions of God in 19th century Mormonism regarded their experiences as veridical and not as imaginary constructs of the mind. The 19th century publication, The Essential Guide to Datura, describes the subjective visionary experience of Datura intoxication as widely perceived to be real. In reviewing first-hand reports of early Mormon visionary experience, we find overlaps of these with contemporary accounts of visions facilitated by entheogenic substances, and with known symptomology associated with entheogenic use. Defenders and critics of Mormonism may understand this paper's thesis as questioning the validity of Mormonism's founding visionary experiences. Nothing can be further from the truth. All human experience and insight emerge in the chemistry of the brain, including the achievements of mathematics, science, epistemology, and even morality. To explore how brain chemistry was involved in Joseph Smith's religious experience and those of other early Mormon believers, and whether entheogens facilitated those experiences, is not to question the spiritual validity and power of those experiences, but to illuminate how such compelling experiences were accessed then and draw implications for how they may be accessed now. If the preponderance of evidence leads to the conclusion that entheogens facilitated many of Smith's visionary experiences and those of many early Mormon converts, then another oddity of the rise of Mormonism is explainable: the dramatic decline in reported visionary experience after Joseph Smith's death. Entheogens as authentic mystical experience. Clinical research with entheogens, psychedelics, indicates that while they produce varying experiences, they also produce mystical experiences, indistinguishable from those produced by non-drug means, i.e. prolonged meditation. A double-blind study in the 1960s with students at the Harvard Divinity School found those sessions facilitated by psilocybin reported experiences ranked immediately and decades later as among the most profound and life-shaping spiritual experiences in their lives. Richards reviewed this and other clinical research and examined their implications for issues in religious studies. The profound and undeniable implications of entheogens are their ability to produce genuine mystical experiences that are phenomenologically indistinguishable from the mystical experiences that result from devoted spiritual practices or which occur spontaneously. The clinical research establishes that it is pharmacology rather than personal expectation alone that enables entheogens to produce the standard core mystical features, such as union with and intuitive knowledge of God, a sense of transcendence of time and space, a connection with sacredness, a sense of ineffability, and a positive mood. This direct encounter with primal religious and mystical experiences provoked by entheogens has profound implications for religious studies in general, and as well we will show here for our understanding of the sacred visionary experience of early Mormonism. Context of Mormon entheogens. Two salient characteristics of the early Mormon religion founded by Joseph Smith in 1830 were A. Converts who were seekers, whose greatest hunger was for spiritual gifts like dreams, visions, tongues, miracles, and spiritual raptures, and B. Converts who would sacrifice everything they possessed, even their own lives, and those of their family, to gather together, establish cities, and build temples to create a New Jerusalem, or Zion in America. While new religions were prevalent in the 19th century America, the zeal with which Mormons defended their religion speaks to the charismatic power of the founding prophet, a charisma which may have leveraged entheogens for chemically induced spiritual awakening. We propose that the entheogenic context of early Mormonism involved sacraments, ordinances, and endowments feeding these seekers' hunger for primary religious experience. Discovering their yearning could be satisfied in Mormonism, seekers flocked to Joseph Smith, swelling church membership from a mere 6 in 1830 to 8,000 living in Nauvoo by 1844, rivaling Chicago in population size. Critical to the rise of convert numbers that the church experienced was that between 1830 and 1836, seeker converts participating in Mormon rituals in which sacraments were ingested or anointing oils applied had the dreams, speaking in tongues, miracles, and spiritual raptures they sought, with many enjoying visions of God and Jesus Christ. The experiences surrounding the dedication of the Kirtland Temple in 1836 have been called the Mormon Pentecost and had a similar impact on the rise of early Mormonism as the early Christian Pentecost had on the rise of Christianity. Both sects faced the same charges of drug-related visions. See Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 31, King James Bible. Sectarian observers were appalled by the strange behaviors associated with visionary sacrament meetings that Mormons had opened to the public. Of this period, the Cleveland Herald and Gazette reported, quote, "Large Mormon meetings, continued for successive days, were held, earnest preachings and alarming exhortations were given, swoons, trances, jerkings, and visions were frequent." End quote. A non-Mormon, medically trained observer, James J. Moss, who witnessed several meetings, concluded that the strange behaviors and visions were produced by drinking medicated sacramental wine, contemplated stealing a bottle to see if it were drugged or not. Importantly, Moss, who was a believing Campbellite and had witnessed Methodist enthusiasm during the same period, distinguished between characteristic religious enthusiasm and sensational early Mormon visionary experience. Although Joseph Smith was not present at these meetings, he attended subsequent meetings where the sacrament produced similar bodily manifestations. In response to the multiple complaints generated by the strange behaviors of Mormon enthusiasts, Smith closed sacrament meetings to outside observers, restricted attendance to male members only, added anointings with oil, and began construction of a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. During the dedication period of the Kirtland Temple in early 1836, en masse visions were once again reported by many of those who participated, with the same accusations of drugged sacramental wine, see below. The evidence for Joseph Smith's use of entheogens, explained in detail in this paper, is primarily based on 6 straightforward phenomena reported or observed during the life of Joseph Smith. Number 1. Entheogens were found in every area the Smith family resided and produced visions and spiritual ecstasies. Number 2. Joseph Smith was mentored by individuals with experience in esoteric fields of knowledge. Number 3. Visionary experience in early Mormonism was frequently on demand rather than spontaneous. Number 4. Joseph Smith devised a method to facilitate dramatic religious experience among his followers. Number 5. There was an association between early Mormon visionary experience and participation in Mormon ordinances, where bread and wine were served and oil anointings were received. Number 6. Visionary experiences of the magnitude experienced during Joseph Smith's life ceased at his death. We find the best explanation for these phenomena is Joseph Smith's personal use of entheogens and his administration of entheogens to early Mormon converts. Entheogens as the means. In contrast to traditional Christianity, Smith consistently understood matter and the body to be sacred, not profane. For Joseph Smith, the physical did not impede the spiritual, but was instead the route to the spiritual. This unique aspect of Joseph Smith's theology and prophetic practice finds expression in his doctrine of means. In Smith's theology, divine action operates through the instrumentality of material causes, including human action and natural law. The Book of Mormon raises this idea to the status of a general law of divine action, asserting, "The Lord worketh through means." Joseph Smith's doctrine that God operates by means and that the physical is a gateway to the spiritual provides a theological rationale for using entheogenic herbs and fungi. In the view of some prominent Mormons, entheogens are not prohibited by Joseph Smith's dietary word of wisdom. Such entheogens would be physical means God had provided for humankind to achieve spiritual ends. Smith's approach anticipated recent developments in the study of religion, particularly the role a physical process plays in religious experience. In this, Smith seemed to anticipate Edward O. Wilson, professor of biology at Harvard and one of the world's leading experts on biological diversity, who concluded that, "We have come to the crucial stage in the history of biology when religion itself is subject to the explanations of natural science." Joseph Smith likely understood that entheogens were a trigger for religious experience, a fact vindicated when considering entheogens as simple molecules cannot create the richness of early Mormon visions and ecstasies without the human capacity for religious experience. Instead, the religious experience is a product of the body through the actions of endogenous and exogenous neurotransmitters on human cognition. Mormons regularly modify their physical chemistry to promote spiritual experience through the Mormon practice of monthly prayer and fasting. But this is an unreliable method of inducing a transcendent spiritual experience of the nature experienced at the foundation of Mormonism. In Smith's 1835 The Word of Wisdom, he overtly endorses the use of one mind-altering substance for spiritual ends, wine in the sacrament of communion. See Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, verse 5. The revelation further teaches that all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution of nature and use of man, every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, all of these to be used with prudence and thanksgiving. See Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, verses 10 through 11. Adherence to the prohibition of addictive substances and the use of herbs carries the promise of wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures, and protection from the destroying angel. See Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, verses 19 through 21. Herbs were a physical means to profound religious experience. experiences that rarely occur without using entheogens. As we discuss, evidence suggests that Smith gained knowledge and skill in working with herbs, including entheogens. Joseph Smith's grandson, Frederick M. Smith, came to the same conclusion as discussed below. Joseph Smith was also a restorationist and advocated a unique form of Native American restoration or revival. From its title page onward, the Book of Mormon advocated a restoration of Native temporal and spiritual powers, and Smith sought alliances with Native Americans and traded objects of spiritual significance with them. If Smith learned of entheogens that bore the imprimatur of Native American shamanism, he would have been likely to seek mentors in their use, not only for himself but also for converts of his church. Besides facilitating religious visions and spiritual ecstasies, entheogens have remarkable antidepressant properties, suggesting a motivation, possibly unconscious, for their use by the Smith family and early Mormonism. So let's dig in for a minute here, because I know this is a lot to process if you don't know what we're talking about here. And there's something here that's going to figure heavily into the rest of the paper. So D. Michael Quinn's book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, is such an incredible resource, not only to illustrate the magical practices of Joseph Smith and the entire Smith family, but to describe the mindset of many people in Western culture at the time. Joseph's magic wasn't something which was compartmentalized in his scrying with a magic seer stone. Magic and spiritualism was the way he understood the world around him. Magic and occultism wasn't a practice. It was a lens by which to see reality. It wasn't just in the prayers that he spoke, but the universe in which he lived. If Joseph Smith woke up and he stubbed his toe, he had a stomach bug, Emma got mad at him, and then he got a bad letter in the mail, then he dealt with accusations by high-ranking members of the church leadership, and they publicly defected. And of course, little Joseph threw a tantrum because he had a fever, and then also a land contract fell through, and then of course it was raining all day when Joe wanted to preach at the town square. This wasn't a string of bad luck. This was punishment by gods or spirits who were displeased, which happens often this time of year when Mercury is in retrograde. You see what I'm saying here? So to rectify these punishments and atone for what he did last week that he was being punished for, it was necessary to speak a specific prayer at a specific time of day with specific people in specific places in the room while eating specific bread and drinking specific wine in a very specific way using the correct hand. Right, everything was interrelated in this worldview. But how did he know who the right people were? How did he know the right layout of the room? Well, you just have to set up a ritualistic system, an initiation rite, and you set up a nonverbal communication system in order to confirm that the people who attend these prayer meetings were also initiates with these same esoteric views and worldviews, right? Nonverbal communication system like special handshakes or something, right? You see, in Joseph Smith's viewpoint, in his world, in his universe, a candle flickers or a unique flower sprouts in a special place in town or in the prairie, or he closes his eyes and then opens his Bible and points to a specific passage and reads it. All of these things happen around him for a reason. That candle flickered because a spirit was responding to something that was said in the room. That unique flower sprouted where it did because something special lies beneath it. God directed his hand to open to that specific passage and that specific page in the Bible because that passage means something special, and that's how God communicates with his messengers. And what's interesting is this is far from a unique mindset of the day, and Joseph... In many ways, he could find plenty of Facebook groups and subreddits of people who think like this today, right? And what is truly amazing is that many users of psychedelics or who use entheogenic sessions, entheogens in these spiritual contexts, they maintain this same mindset about the plant medicines that they use for their own spiritual or mystical practices. Look, the plants don't just have a verifiable and a predictable effect on the person's brain chemistry. In their minds, the plant connects them with what they call God or the universe or actual reality. These herbs are placed here by God to help us little humans to view its mind and see reality in a way that our default mode network can never perceive. Communicating the mentally perceived attributes of these plants and fungi is impossible. These experiences are ineffable, whether by virtue of the experiences existing before language or human language is only beginning to catch up with what these experiences are. So for many users, God is the only word that comes to mind to describe what there is going on inside their mind. And even those three little letters don't do the experience justice. For the user, the psychedelic used in the context of entheogenic experiences opens up the world of mysteries that the ancients sought to unfold in their religious practices. The same mysteries that built the pyramids, that created society, that builds symbols into stone edifices and pervades pop culture, all of which hides in plain sight but can only be seen with initiated eyes once the scales have fallen. God talks to users through the plants. You see, this is the magical worldview. So, while D. Michael Quinn's book, Early Mormonism and the Magical Worldview, went so far in discussing and describing what the magic worldview was, it missed the entheogenic aspect which catalyzes the theophany so often attendant before the magical worldview is adhered to. Now, this worldview, it was prevalent in Western cultures, which shaped the founder of Mormonism. And in many ways, it is alive and well to this day when people are simultaneously driving cars and they post photographs of galaxies millions of light years away on social media using their smartphones. I mean, it's truly a remarkable world we humans have created for ourselves. Let's continue on. Wholesome herbs God hath ordained. That Joseph Smith did not consider entheogens a problem is evident from his attitudes towards herbs. Joseph Smith knew of herbs and their uses and claimed the requisite knowledge and skill to devise and prescribe herbal remedies for others. Joseph Smith's development into a village scryer or seer involved following the path set forward in several esoteric traditions of the area he grew up, and possibly from his interpretation of biblical passages, indicating the ingestion of some material preceding the visions of Ezekiel and John as discussed below. In line with other health edicts of the 19th century, in 1835 Joseph Smith delivered a revelation called the Word of Wisdom, suggesting dietary practices and the proper and improper use of alcohol, tobacco, and other substances. However, Smith carved out an exception for plant and herb medicine in the Word of Wisdom. Quote, "And again, verily, I say unto you, all wholesome herbs God hath ordained for the constitution, nature, and use of man, every herb in the season thereof, and every fruit in the season thereof, all these to be used with prudence and thanksgiving." End quote. The first anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled, by Eber D. Howe, 1834, attributed the exemption carved out for herbs in the season thereof to Frederick G. Williams's influence on Joseph Smith, discussed below. Howe referenced Williams's herbarium on either side of his Kirtland home while disparaging his communion with spirits from other worlds. Howe continues, quote, "We are next told that every wholesome herb God ordained for the use of man, and we should infer that the writer or the recording angel had been inducted into the modern use of herbs by the celebrated Dr. Frederick G. Williams in Kirtland. F. G. Williams is a revised quack, well known in this vicinity by his herbarium on either side of his house, but whether he claims protection by right of letters, patent from the general government, or by communion with spirits from other worlds, we are not authorized to determine." End quote. The Smith family exemption of entheogenic herbs as prohibited substances in the Word of Wisdom seems generational, considering that Joseph Jr.'s grandson, Frederick M. Smith, also a prophet to the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, carved out a similar exemption for peyote as discussed below. We begin by examining the historical setting of entheogenic practices of Joseph Smith Jr. and his ancestors, mentors, and colleagues. We then summarize the evidence for the entheogens available to Joseph Smith and his mentors, followed by descriptions of early Mormon visions and ecstasies. We correlate with a clinical syndrome suggestive of intoxication with visionary anticholinergic substances. Historical setting: ancestors, mentors, and colleagues. For Joseph Smith to fulfill his promise that every Mormon convert would have visions of God and spiritual ecstasies, he needed assistance from trusted associates who would covertly procure, process, store, and administer entheogens. Several early church leaders, including the Smiths, Cowdery, and Wimmer families in particular, were deeply invested in the study of occult practices and herbal, plant, pharmaceutical, folk medicine craft, and the utilization of spirituous liquors. Salem Witch Trials. The Smith family involvement with the magic worldview and possibly entheogenic material went back several generations. For instance, the Smiths were involved with the witch trials in 17th century Salem, Massachusetts, that may have been instigated by the psychedelic ergot fungi. Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith's great-grandfather, gave testimony in April 1692 that Mary Eastie threatened him, after which he reported, quote, "I received a little blow on my shoulder, and the stone wall rattled very much." End quote. After the Salem witch trials, other generations of his ancestors resided in areas noted for beliefs and practices of folk magic and alchemy. European occultism also shaped the cultural milieu in which the witch trials occurred. Mormon historian B.H. Roberts noted, quote, "It is indeed scarcely conceivable how one could live in New England in the 18th and 19th centuries and not have shared such beliefs." End quote. The hypothesis of ergotism as the culprit in the Salem witch trials of 1692 is based on the signs of convulsive ergotism, including seeing apparitions, feeling pinpricks, pinches, burning sensations, and by symptoms of urinary obstruction. However, those afflicted had none of the constitutional symptoms or residual effects known to occur with ergot poisoning, making poisoning by ergot-infested rye bread less likely. The manifest symptoms were attributed to poisons made by Tituba, a South American Arawak Indian or Caribbean enslaved person, owned by the Reverend Samuel Parris. Tituba was familiar with hoodoo religion and plant medicines from her African heritage, and could have prepared an anticholinergic such as datura. This could have produced the symptoms ascribed to Paris's daughter and her cousin, the first quote-unquote bewitched inhabitant of Salem, whose behaviors resembled the anticholinergic, toxidromal, and dissociative features of hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Joseph Smith Sr. The founding prophet of Mormonism, Joseph Smith Jr., was born on December 23, 1805, into a Christian family enmeshed in folk magic and the occult. Joseph Smith's father, along with his other sons Alvin and Joseph Jr., engaged in the, quote, more esoteric components of the Western New York religious cultural situation, end quote. Joseph Smith's earliest mentor was his father, who we believe would have communicated his entheogenic and magico-religious knowledge to his sons. Ginseng extraction. Joseph Sr.'s knowledge of preparing plant extracts was recorded in 1811 when he collected and crystallized the 2018 equivalent of $57,000 worth of ginseng root, intended for sale in China. Administration of ginseng root extract compares well with modafinil, a widely prescribed pharmaceutical drug used to treat excessive daytime sleepiness associated with narcolepsy or shift work. Having crystallized and likely made use of this psychoactive themselves, the Smiths would have no difficulty collecting, processing, and storing more potent psychoactive plants and fungi for their medicinal and magico-religious purposes. Family magical practices. Quinn has argued that the Smiths, who lived in Vermont, New Hampshire, upstate New York, and northern Ohio, engaged in several magico-religious practitioners, of which Luman Walters, discussed below, played a significant role as mentor to both Joseph and his father. The Smith family, including Joseph Jr., possessed and employed several magic-related artifacts, including astrological charts, magical parchments, a ceremonial dagger, an alchemical amulet, a silver Jupiter talisman, and a cane that all manifest directed indebtedness to occultists including Sibley, Scott, Agrippa, and Barrett. Quinn characterizes these occult books of enormous significance to the Smith family, especially Joseph Jr., whose cane was inscribed with symbols from the Magus, conveying the message, quote, "Jupiter reigns over Joseph Smith," end quote. Shown in Figure 3 is the silver Jupiter talisman, also bearing the markings of Jupiter. Joseph Smith Jr. possessed a Jupiter talisman and a cane with a carved serpent, a character in the Edenic allegory, and one animal believed to be governed by both Saturn and Jupiter. This, Quinn argues, shows that Smith relied on the works of occultists Francis Barrett and Henrik Cornelius Agrippa. Agrippa names henbane, mandrake, and black poppy as 3 herbs under the power of Jupiter. According to Barrett, henbane and black poppy are among the herbs used to invoke the images of spirits through proper suffumigations involving henbane, hemlock, black poppies, mandrake root, and other plants. Also, Joseph Smith possessed an esoteric amulet that seems to bear symbols belonging to both alchemy and masonry, and representing psilocybe species mushrooms, which we discuss below. Let's pause for a second. Just a very brief point to make here. When it comes to manipulating plants, whether that's extraction, storage, reducing, infusing, whatever, the practice is similar with many different plants. Like a person who can crystallize ginseng, like Joseph Smith Sr., could utilize that same foundation of knowledge of herb craft in order to manipulate many other plants in similar ways. So what does that look like? Well, for many plants, you can just drop the roots or the stalks or the seeds or the fruiting bodies or other parts into an alcoholic solvent of some sort, like wine or whiskey, or even into water. Most medicines were delivered via alcohol at this time. And then, of course, combinations of multiple plants obviously rendered each psychoactive or medicinal profile of each of those plants into the mixture. And of course, many plant chemicals interact with each other in unique ways. So those mixtures could be administered in many ways, like collyriums, which are eye drops, fuming or suffumigation, as it was called, which is smoking. They could be drank. They could be applied transdermally as an oil or as a cream or salve. They could be inserted rectally or vaginally. They could be mixed into an herbal tea or boiled into a concoction. They could be injected into the veins. Basically, any way that you can get the plant into you, people have been doing it for a long time, right? The invention of the syringe and the pill capsule has revolutionized medicine, but in the 19th century and for millennia before, people have been doing all sorts of interesting things to get plant medicines into their bodies somehow, right? So the ability to render plants into a form that they could be consumed, like crystallization, is a massive skill set with a healthy body of literature and cultural knowledge passed orally through families and through entire demographics. So Joseph Sr. crystallizing ginseng is merely a window into a set of skills that he'd likely cultivated for decades by gleaning it from family members and from mentors and from books that he read. They also, I don't know how to convey this any other way. People in the 19th century didn't have the same cultural prohibitions and perspectives that we currently have on many of these plants, right? So what we view today as a psychedelic drug, that was just another plant which required a certain expertise to find and harvest and utilize and to consume in a specific way, right? Like herbal knowledge was deeply infused in the magical worldview as all wholesome herbs God hath ordained, right? Some of these plants stop pain. Some of them cure infections. Some of them were poisonous. Some of them allowed the user to perceive a plane of reality and existence only perceptible through the use of these specific plants. For us to believe that the Smith family and their contemporary Americans had some kind of moratorium or prohibition on just certain plants the way that we do today is presentism, and it's a flawed way to study history. It is imposing our current cultural views on the people we are studying in history when they simply don't exist at the time. Let's continue on. The visions of Joseph Smith's parents. In 1853, Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, related several family dreams in her book Biographical Sketches of Joseph Smith, the Prophet, and his progenitors for many generations, and from which we learn about Joseph Smith's life growing up in the magically and religiously charged environments of sparsely populated New England and upstate New York. Lucy's first vision. The golden Amanita muscaria could be the mushroom that best fits Lucy Smith's remarkable first vision. Lucy's dream occurred circa 1802 to 1808, at least 3 years before her husband's two dreams in 1811, described below, and 12 years before her son's first vision. Joseph Sr. had just informed Lucy it was best for her to desist attending the Methodist Church because his father and older brother were very displeased. Lucy related that, quote, "After praying for some time, she fell asleep and had the following dream, in which she saw trees that were very beautiful. They were well proportioned and towered with majestic beauty to a great height. I saw one of them was surrounded with a bright belt that shone like burnished gold, but far more brilliantly." End quote. Amanita muscaria occasionally form fairy rings around the host tree, and the color of a mature Amanita muscaria, as shown in Figure 5, quote, takes on a metallic sheen ranging in color from red-orange to golden or bronze, end quote, a feature enhanced by early morning or evening light. Further, aging and drying converts ibotenic acid to the more hallucinogenic and less toxic muscimol, and once completely dry, the golden mushroom's power is complete. A golden Amanita muscaria surrounding its host tree may have been one of Lucy's walking memories and incorporated into this dream. Lucy's dream ended with her mood lightened as she concluded that her husband would share her feelings when, quote, "more advanced in life would rejoice therein, and unto him would be added intelligence, happiness, glory, and everlasting life," end quote. Lucy's dream included a conscious memory of having seen a burnished gold ring, probably of Amanita muscaria. If Lucy deliberately tried this entheogenic fungus, she may have done so as a treatment for her lifelong depression. Joseph Smith Sr.'s first vision. Two dreams reported by Joseph Smith Sr. strongly suggest experience with entheogens, whose content contains not only allusions to entheogens, but also some familiarity with esoteric allegory and symbolism. Datura Dream. In what his wife described as his first vision, Joseph Sr. found himself entirely alone, although accompanied by an attendant spirit. In the desolate field before him, Joseph Sr. saw only dead fallen timber and heard only death-like silence. Querying his attendant spirit on the meaning of such desolation and dreariness, Joseph Sr. was told that ahead he would find, quote, "on a certain log a box, the contents of which, if you eat thereof, will make you wise," end quote. Shortly after tasting the contents, Joseph Sr. reports being threatened by all manner of beasts, bellowing most terrifically. In the panic, Joseph Sr. escaped on the fly when he returned to his natural senses. Joseph Sr. found himself trembling. Despite the frightful experience, Joseph Sr. reported being perfectly happy. The following Datura experience posted online is impressive for its robust emotional impact, the overlay of visionary material on everyday reality, and the generation of a different reality. Quote, "You effectively keep your rational, sober mind along with your ego while on Datura. It's rather that your sober mind is experiencing a completely different reality. Imagine normal sobriety, but as you start to dream while awake. Rather than enlightenment through ego death, the night shades offer dimensional travel to other planes of reality." End quote. The frightening aspect of Smith's dream suggests a waking experience with Datura fruit and his memory of the biblical warnings of death, quote, "thou shalt surely die," end quote, associated with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, coupled with his awareness of reports of fatalities associated with Datura poisoning. Smith's guide echoes the serpent in Genesis chapter 3, verse 3, who advises that eating of the fruit will make you wise. An element of Joseph Sr.'s first dream reappears in his second dream, thorns. Significantly, thorns are introduced into the world, according to Genesis chapter 3, verse 3, because of the ingestion of the forbidden fruit of the tree, perhaps symbolically referencing the thorny mature datura seed pod. What then was the knowledge that Joseph Sr. received from his spirit guide and his dreams? According to his wife, following his two dreams, Joseph Sr., quote, seemed more confirmed than ever in the opinion that there was no order or class of religionists, that they knew any more concerning the kingdom of God than those of the world or such as made no profession of religion whatever, end quote. Amanita Muscaria Dream. The same year as the first dream, Joseph Sr. had a second entheogen-related dream, which involved basking in ecstasy, the joy and love associated with the Edenic tree of life. In this dream, which he related to his wife Lucy, a psychopomp leads Joseph Sr. to a tree with, quote, beautiful branches spread themselves somewhat like an umbrella, and it bore a kind of fruit in shape much like a chestnut burr and as white as snow, or, if possible, whiter. As he watched, the chestnut shells commenced opening and shedding their particles, or the fruit which they contained, which was of dazzling whiteness. When he partook of the fruit, he experienced something delicious beyond description, and inviting his family to eat, they got down upon their knees and scooped the fruit up, eating it by double handfuls. End quote. In this dream, Joseph Sr. incorporates the spiny, thorny fruit of the chestnut, a feature of the first dream, which is similar in appearance to the fruit of datura. Instead of datura, however, the umbrella-shaped fruit, scooped from the ground in the second dream, evokes images of dazzling white spores dropping from the gills of an Amanita muscaria against a bright background or on a black surface. Joseph Sr.'s esoteric Christian Amanita muscaria dream concludes with Joseph Sr. explaining to his wife, Lucy, quote, I drew near and began to eat of the fruit, and found it delicious beyond description. As I was eating, I said in my heart, I cannot eat this alone. I must bring my wife and children, that they may partake with me. I went and brought my family, which consisted of a wife and 7 children, and we all commenced eating and praising God for this blessing. We were exceedingly happy, insomuch that our joy could not easily be expressed. End quote. Emma Smith. Emma Hale, Joseph's wife, was gifted in using herbs. One of Emma's medicines was a healing salve that contained Jimson weed, or Datura stramonium, and when the Sauk Indians visited Nauvoo in 1841, she exchanged recipes for herbal medicines with the wife of Chief Keokuk. In 1867, Emma wrote to her son, Joseph Smith III, quote, I will tell you now how I make the salve. Of sweet elder bark, a good large handful after it is scraped, and as much Jimson leaves and buds if they are green and tender enough to be pounded up fine. End quote. Emma's grandchildren also reported her use of psychoactive medicinal beer, ginseng, and lobelia, or Indian tobacco. Ginseng has stimulant, antidepressant, and aphrodisiac properties, while lobelia, a hallucinogen and sedative, had entheogenic uses among Native Americans. Let's take a second to talk about datura. It's a super interesting candidate in the discussion of early Mormon psychedelics. So Joseph Sr.'s dream clearly seems to describe what sounds like datura, and Emma's healing salve recipe explicitly describes the use of Jimson weed, or datura, right? Contemporary herbal remedy books include datura so much. It's a mainstay of these herbal remedy books, and it's used as a remedy for all sorts of things, including like asthma. But all of those herbal books caution against liberal use of datura because it causes catatonic states, it sends persons into convulsions, and then it sends people to their graves. Modern trip reports of datura are absolutely remarkable. Now, the quote that we featured from that person using datura back in 2008, that's only a tiny window into the power that datura plant holds. So what I mean is, like with many psychedelics, the user perceives a reality that can't possibly exist, and they know that they are experiencing the effects. You know, walls will shimmer and fractal patterns will emerge. Depth perception is altered. And, you know, the person on like mushrooms or LSD, they'll look at their hands and like lines and patterns will form, or their hands will seem like they aren't actually attached to them anymore. These are all pretty standard. However, with Datura, the experience is completely different. The user, in some ways, retains their sober faculties, but they can see and interact with people that aren't even there, while nothing else in the environment seems altered. Time loses all meaning, and the users frequently forget that they even took the dosage. Now, one trip report that I read on the patron-exclusive version of the John Whitmer presentation episode, we talked about these trip reports, and somebody was like watching Whose Line Is It Anyway while they were eating a bowl of cereal for a while, and then they realized that the TV wasn't even on. Another person sat around in their backyard with a group of friends and conversed for hours while smoking cannabis, only to realize that the friends weren't even there. Reality stayed relatively consistent. They were just seeing things that weren't there. The visions, the manifestations, the hallucinations of Datura are completely different. So for people who are believing in spirits and apparitions and the magic worldview, Datura is the perfect entheogen to facilitate spirit conjuration within this magical and occult context. A person can converse with an image of a spirit or of a deity when an observer watching this will just see the person like writhing on the floor or mumbling while they're walking around the room. Datura is a crazy drug. And I would encourage listeners to, Google and read a few trip reports on Erowid or something to understand why Datura stands out as a particular shining candidate in the Smith entheogen theory. Also, stuff is everywhere. Datura is everywhere. I found some on the side of the road when I was driving through California, and different species of Datura crop up all across the planet at different times a year. And notably, 2 of the 3 primary psychoactive ingredients are used in medicine today as an anesthetic and as a transdermal patch for seasickness. Datura is a super interesting drug. Let's go ahead and get back to the paper. Native Americans. Smith always lived close to Native Americans and was likely influenced by shamanic activities. For instance, the Algonquin in the northeastern and Great Plains, the Iroquois in the northeast, and the Cherokee in the southeast, and their shamans resided close enough to Joseph Smith that he would have been captivated by their religious and medical practices. In 1822, Seneca Indian chief Red Jacket, nephew of Chief Handsome Lake, spoke only miles from where Joseph Smith lived. Red Jacket might have sparked 17-year-old Joseph Smith's interest in Native American culture and seeking a Native American shamanic mentoring. Joseph Smith demonstrated his interest in Native American life at age 18 when he regaled his family with stories of ancient Indian life, and later partially built his prophetic career on a Native American platform with the Book of Mormon. Comparative religionist A.K.V. Strom has demonstrated many parallels of Joseph Smith's teachings and practices to those of Native American religions of the northeastern North America, especially that of the Algonquins. The parallels are extensive enough that Strom posits that the boy Joseph may have been heavily influenced by an Algonquin neighbor. Smith's Native American influences may have included North American entheogens such as Datura stramonium, Amanita muscaria, and psilocybe species. The Native Americans used entheogens in medical and spiritual practices such as the Ojibwe Mindewiwin or Grand Medical Society. The Ojibwe Anishinaabe people, in their legend of Misquito, describe the use and effects of Amanita muscaria. We summarize here the version told by medicine woman Kiwe-Dinokwai Pechel, where Misquito, the red-topped mushrooms, the spiritual children of grandmother Cedar and grandfather Birch. 2 brothers came upon Mosquito, turning and revolving, buzzing and murmuring, singing a strange song of happiness under a brilliant sunny sky. The older brother tried to dissuade his younger brother from eating the mushroom, but defies his brother and merged with the mushroom, becoming a mosquito himself. Distraught, the older brother ran home to ask the medicine man what to do, and he was told to return, locate the chief and the wisest mosquito, and stick the quills of an eagle feather through each of their stripes to stop them turning and singing songs of happiness, then to do the same to his younger brother and carry him home. He followed the elder's instruction, and his younger brother turned back into his previous form. However, after returning home, the older brother arose in the morning with his heart heavy with sadness and foreboding, while his younger brother arose smiling each day, his heart filled with happiness, his lips singing merriment. The older brother became suspicious when the younger brother urinated more frequently and took longer than before. When the older brother investigated, he found his younger brother with arms are wide open, spread like the umbrella of a mushroom, with beautiful robes glowing red and tufts of white, singing with a voice of happiness to the people following him. Now and forever, older brothers are unhappy in contrast to the younger brothers who drink the elixir of the great mosquito, learning much of the supernatural and other knowledge by drinking the liquid power of the sun. Together, these stories transmit knowledge about Amanita muscaria, where to look for it, how to recognize it, the joys it can bestow, and the displeasure of authorities if consumed. For instance, these mushrooms are always associated with trees such as cedar and birch, and have red tops with white tufts. The experience of ingesting these mushrooms includes transient ego dissolution, unity with the divine, and mood elevations. The stories also warn of authoritarian displeasure, who themselves refuse filling their hearts with happiness, try to suppress its uses. In the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith relates a similar story about Lehi's use of entheogens. Lehi comes upon a tree laden with fruit that filled his soul with exceeding great joy. However, others, whose dress was exceeding fine, mocked and pointed their fingers at those partaking of the fruit. The scoffing caused some who ate from the tree to feel ashamed and fall away into forbidden paths. Midewiwin shaman are believed to possess the power of long life, even victory over death through healing plants and the rituals. Such power strongly suggests that, among other herbal remedies, the Midewiwin shaman utilized entheogenic material. Delaware and Mohegan peoples were familiar with datura. Native Americans living in Virginia gave a psychoactive brew called Wissahickon to their young men during a rite of passage, causing a derangement for 20 days, strongly suggesting it included Datura stramonium, or Amanita muscaria. Most North American Eastern Woodland Indian groups reported Datura as the base of a narcotic drink used in manhood initiation rites. In 1705, Virginian Indians were reported to have been using datura in their religious ceremonies, and there was widespread use of datura in initiation ceremonies in native North America. Further, sometimes Eastern Native Americans would add datura and other powerful substances to tobacco to prepare a particularly potent smoke. Growing up into adulthood, Smith lived relatively near to the Algonquin areas of the Potawatomi, Ojibwa, and Delaware peoples, whom all belonged to the Algonquin family. We will explore Smith's relationships with this group of people when we discuss his transactions with the Potawatomi in the early 1840s Nauvoo. However, it is enough to note that Smith likely noted the secretive Midewiwin Medical Society with its selective membership, graded training of new shamans, and their use of psychoactive materials including datura and Amanita muscaria. Esoteric Christianity. Joseph Smith was influenced at a young age by several categories of esotericism, including esoteric Christianity, spiritual alchemy, and speculative Freemasonry. Significantly, some members of these esoteric schools of thought had an interest in entheogen use and encoded their knowledge in esoteric works of art. During the 13th century, esoteric Christian artists painted biblical themes associated with entheogenic mushrooms. For instance, in Figure 6 is an Eden panel found in St. Michael's Church, Germany, circa 1240 CE, showing Adam and Eve standing and a serpent coiled on a tree in front of a spotted Amanita muscaria mushroom cap. Also in Figure 7, the Edenic tree also takes on the form of an Amanita muscaria in circa 1291 Fresno, found in Plain Carrault Abbey in France. Figure 8 shows a painting by the Flemish artist Petrus Christus, circa 1410 to 1475, portraying the child Christ laying supine on an Amanita muscaria bed, looked over by Joseph, Mary, and winged angels. The relative abundance of Christian Amanita muscaria syncretic art led Antonio Escotado to conclude, quote, "It seems indisputable that there is a connection between visionary mushrooms and Christianity," end quote. There are reasons to think that given his esoteric background, Joseph Smith or one of his mentors had access to this art, decrypted it, and then encoded in Smith's teachings, revelations, and ordinances. Where then did Joseph Smith first learn of alchemy and esoteric Christianity? In his book, Magic Mushrooms in Religion and Alchemy, Heinrich discusses the relationship between esoteric Christianity and using Amanita muscaria as a sacramental meal. According to Heinrich, Jesus unmistakably identifies himself with an entheogenic substance, an elixir of life and bread of heaven, the Amanita muscaria mushroom shown in Figure 9. Heinrich quotes Jesus telling a woman, quote, "Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in a well of water springing up into eternal life." End quote. The living water, according to Heinrich, is water-soluble muscimol, the principal psychoactive in Amanita muscaria. Muscimol is excreted unchanged in the urine, which the shaman or others can consume. Supporting Heinrich's argument of entheogenic urine, we note Jesus' saying in John chapter 7, verse 8, quote, "He that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water." End quote. The phrase, "out of Jesus' belly," may describe entheogenic-laced urine. Due to physiological processes, urine after ingesting Amanita muscaria is more potent than the tea initially consumed. The entheogenic component of Amanita muscaria is water-soluble, and when extracted with water, turns the water the color of red wine. Further, the mushroom's upturned cap becomes the cup holding the elixir of life, and the mushroom itself becomes the life-giving bread. Heinrich quotes Jesus telling his disciples, quote, "I am the living bread that has come down from heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I shall give is my flesh. If you do not eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have life in you. Anyone who does eat my flesh and drink my blood has eternal life, for my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. As I, who am sent by the living Father, myself draw life from the Father, so whoever eats me will draw life from me. This is the bread come down from heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever." End quote. Implied in Heinrich's discussion of these passages is his confidence that anyone using entheogens in a Christian context will experience many of the states described in mystical Christianity. Although most of Smith's revelations and teachings suggest the traditional Christian understandings of Jesus, occasionally he betrayed a different view. For instance, in 1844, Smith is reported to have said, quote, "I am the only man that has ever been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. Neither Paul, John, Peter, nor Jesus ever did it. The followers of Jesus ran away from him, but the Latter-day Saints never ran away from me yet." End quote. In this statement, Smith seems to suggest that Jesus did not differ from him, meaning that Smith understood Jesus as shaman-like, as a human and not a god. Likewise, Jesus-like, Smith healed the lame arm of Mrs. John Johnson and raised William Huntington from the dead. Spiritual alchemy. Owens argues that Joseph Smith, quote, "certainly learned about the philosopher's stone and alchemy's transmutational mystery," end quote. Alchemy became a subject of several artists in Europe. Owens argues that Smith likely learned about alchemy from a physician named Luman Walters, who was a distant cousin of Smith's future wife and a member of the circle associated with the early treasure quests, of which young Joseph was a member. Agreeing with Owens, D. Michael Quinn reasons that Walters was Smith's teenage mentor and occult advisor. In his book, Science, Alchemy, and the Great Plague of London, William S. Shelley stated, quote, that alchemical writings concerned chemical processes from their late antique beginning until the Renaissance. Spiritual alchemy originated, it would appear, in the early 16th century when Paracelsus blended his medical practice of alchemy with his interest in the Hermetic Platonic tradition of Renaissance esotericism. End quote. Sometime late in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, alchemical texts seem to be exclusively spiritual, that is, that have no apparent interest in practical laboratory procedures. English alchemists such as Eliza Ashmole and Robert Boyle, according to Shelley, quote, were concerned with one or more substances, termed the red stone, the angelic stone, and otherwise, whose effects were described as spiritual. Shelley then argues, these are substances that produced mystical experiences and was implicitly psychoactive, and associates it with the motif of Israelite manna, the hidden manna of Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, the Hermetic tradition, English alchemical literature from the Tudor period onward, and in the 12th century theology of the School of Lyon, northern France, after spreading to Cistercian, Franciscan, and other writers. End quote. Heinrich explores the connection between alchemy and entheogens, including the allegorical use of the rebus, such as the one in Figure 10, to transmit privileged knowledge of entheogenic Amanita muscaria. The rebus is a double-headed hermaphrodite linked to the prima materia, philosopher's stone, an elixir of life within the allegory, Amanita muscaria. According to Lewis Spence, one of the grand objects of alchemy was the discovery of an elixir to ensure health and prevent death, elixirs of life containing herbs and medicinals that Heinrich argues are entheogens. We now examine an amulet in Figure 11 belonging to Joseph Smith and gifted to Eliza R. Snow, his most esoteric plural wife. Figure 12 shows an inverted mushroom species, presumably psilocybin, comparing favorably to the mushroom-appearing tassels dangling from both the belt worn by the rebus in Figure 13 and the belt engraved on Joseph Smith's amulet in Figure 14. It is reasonable to propose that Figures 11 and 13 represent the same thing, psilocybe species mushrooms. Speculative Masonry. Mormon historian and former director of the Institute of Religion in Salt Lake City, Reed C. Durham, documented Joseph Smith's Masonic heritage and his adoption of Masonic ritual and iconography found in the Mormon Nauvoo Temple endowment. The Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, founded at the end of 1839, anticipated the spring of 1842 groundbreaking of the Nauvoo Temple. Joseph Smith's father and older brother, Joseph Sr. and Hiram, respectively, were both Masons, and Joseph Jr. was likely familiar with Captain William Morgan, famously murdered for publishing The Secrets of Masonry in 1826. After Morgan's death, his widow, Lucinda Morgan, secretly became one of Smith's 33 known plural wives in 1838. Early Mormon leaders and successors to Joseph Smith, including Brigham Young, the leader of Mormonism's most successful schism, were deeply involved in Masonry before their conversion to Mormonism. There were Masonic motifs, architecture, ritual, and iconography in the Nauvoo, Illinois temple. For example, on the outside architecture of the temple were the Masonic sunstones, upside-down five-pointed star stones, moonstones, and a Masonic compass and a square weather vane. Inside the temple, the Masonic all-searching eye was shown in the original architect's drawing. Joseph's mother, Lucy Smith, revealed how, for a season, that we stopped our labor and went trying to win the faculty of Abrac, a secret Masonic process with roots in much older traditions. Mormon scholar and historian Michael Quinn reports that the, quote, faculty of Abrac was a well-known phrase linking magic and divinity. Medieval and early modern magic manuscripts in England used Abrac and Abraca as one of the names of God in conjurations, and that Abraxas was a Gnostic name for God that had become associated with magic. End quote. In America, as in Europe, speculative masonry subsumed many mysteries in the ancient world. There is evidence to suggest that these mysteries utilized entheogens, including the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, the Demeter-Persephone cult, and the Dionysiac mystery cults. The Roman Phrygian rites for Magna Mater and the Mithraic cults of Persia, and the mysteries surrounding the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, are all suspected of entheogenic use in their rites. According to Chris Bennett, quote, "The imagery of the Masonic Lodge was built with a set and setting that in many ways could be enhanced by the use of entheogens," end quote. And the idea that some, quote, "Masonic dreams may be a remnant of early sacramental potions that contained psychoactive ingredients has been pondered for well over a century," end quote. For instance, Bennett quotes from an 1835 Masonic history by John Fellows, who, in rehearsing the entheogens of ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans, and Druids, refers to a soporific cake of honey and medicated grain, medicatus frugibus, i.e. drugged, along with preparations of poppy and other psychoactive substance, with fellow Mason as its target audience. Bennett then notes Fellows informing the candidate that is drinking the poison offered to him during initiation. It is a Eucharist by which the real presence of the Savior is manifest. In his book Alchemically Stoned, the 33rd degree Mason P.D. Newman argues that features of Masonic ceremonies, architecture, and accoutrements strongly suggest some Masonic lodges used entheogenic material from acacia species known to contain the psychedelic dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. Shannon and Nemu similarly argue for the Hebraic use of the entheogenic acacia tree. According to Mormon writer Jeffrey Bradshaw, quote, "In the ceremonies of the Royal Arch degree of the York Rite, candidates pass through a series of veils and eventually enter into the divine presence," end quote. But in the Nauvoo Temple endowment, it is not mere representation, but is the reality of coming into a heavenly presence. Mormon historian Andrew Ehat explains, quote, "In temples we have a staged representation of the step-by-step ascent into the presence of the eternal while we are yet alive. And there should have been a change in us, as there certainly was with Moses, when he was caught up to celestial realms and saw and heard things unlawful to utter," end quote. We argue that the change required to be caught up to celestial realms required the administration of an entheogen, a change that, like in Kirtland, would produce observable symptomology. If this hypothesis is correct, an entheogenic endowment may have been the source of Smith's confidence that converts would in reality be caught up to celestial realms. The secret that Smith needed converts to keep was the visible symptomology they would observe during the Nauvoo Temple endowment. Policy of secrecy. In an 1841 meeting, Joseph Smith explained a purpose of the lodge is to learn to keep secrets. Smith explained, quote, "The reason we do not have the secrets of the Lord revealed unto us is because we do not keep them," and later observed, "The secret of Masonry is to keep a secret," end quote. What did Smith want to keep secret? Besides Smith's unusual marriage practice and his kingdom-building ambitions, we argue it was to keep secret administration of an entheogen in his endowment. We've been going for a while, and this is obviously a massive topic. So let's just wrap up real quick. Creating a system of entheogenic administration and shamanism is certainly a challenge, one which Joseph Smith seems to have embarked upon and expanded throughout his rise to religious prominence in 19th century America. What we are illustrating with this paper is the key to Smith's shamanistic practices could lie in something that is replicable, reliable, and accessible to modern-day testability. As will be demonstrated through parts 2 and 3 of reading through this paper, Smith made a cognizant shift from openly practicing his shamanistic ritualism, largely attended by close members and acolytes, but open to the public, into very tightly sealed closed-door meetings with only approved fellow initiates in attendance. The obvious need for increased security and secrecy under the guise of sacredness was required to keep the balance between control and charisma in check. The remainder of this paper will chronicle Smith's career as a shaman with the foundation established so far. Entheogens had roots in magic and occult esotericism. Entheogens were present in some Masonic initiation rites. Entheogens were present in many indigenous societies, of which Smith took particular interest throughout his life. We believe it is reasonable to conclude entheogens were also present in early Mormonism and can serve to explain the fall of visionary Mormonism after the death of the founder shaman, Joseph Smith, in 1844. There's plenty more to get to, but as I said, we've been going on for a long while, so we'll do 2 more parts where we really get into the juicy bits of early Mormon history. Today was merely setting the cultural scene from which Mormonism evolved. Thank you so much for everything, listeners. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.